Rosemary, what time are you at over
Better.
there?
It's 11. It's 11, nearly 11 o'clock at night.
Okay. All right. And if at any time
That's
you
all
get,
right. Sleep is for the kind.
yeah, if you get to that point where we reach 2 o'clock in the morning, your time, or anything.
I realised when I watched back the fantasy one that it looked like I'd fallen asleep. And
It's
then
okay.
And then what had actually happened is that the internet connection had gone down,
Yeah.
and then I couldn't see you, and I thought you couldn't see me, so I was resting my eyes.
Yeah.
And then I watched it back and looked like I'd fallen asleep and just turned it off in disgust.
It's okay. It's all right. You look beautiful. All right. I actually put together a little something, and I'm trying to figure out how to pull this off, because it's really, I want to play Writer Whiz. Are you a writer or are you a whiz? And it's a little game I put together, and I'm trying to figure out, it's very easy to play if I have 2 other people, but I have 4, so I think we'll do teams.
Okay.
So
That makes it competitive, doesn't it? When you
we can do, well, there's a couple ways we can do this. We can do girls against boys. We can do however you want. So pick teams. Yeah, it's last minute, and I'm throwing it at you. It's okay. Pick teams.
I usually just wait to go last because that's how it works
That's
in
right.
football.
We just going first.
What?
All right, we just going first. And let me see here. All right, we're gonna do Weech and Tim against Rosemary and Anita. Weech, I'm gonna put you on part 1, and Tim, you're gonna do part 2, and then same thing for the girls, and I'll go through it. And this is supposed to be as fast as you can answer. No time to think. Don't you dare stop. And the person who, well, there's no scoring. I'm just doing it for fun, and I'll decide a winner just because it'll be random. So, Weech, answer these 5 questions as fast as you can.
Okay.
All right. The best way to kill a person is?
With a gun.
Okay. When I have writer's block, I?
Keep writing.
The weirdest thing I've ever researched is?
How to kill a person.
I would never write blank.
Romance.
I wish readers would?
Read my book.
Okay. All right. And Tim, here's part 2. Tell me the first thing that comes in your mind when I say villain.
Dark.
Murder.
Fun.
Caffeine.
Sorry.
Oxford comma.
Pointless.
oh, that man after my own heart.
Outdated.
Oh, and the muse.
Entertainment.
Okay. And Rosemary, I'm going to start you on part 1. The best way to kill a person is?
Vampire.
When I have writer's block, I
don't have it.
The weirdest thing I've ever researched is?
London Bridge.
I would never write?
Nothing.
I wish readers would?
Talk to me.
Okay, and me too. All right, Anita, and tell me the first thing that comes in your mind when I say villain.
Bad.
Murder.
Blood.
Coffee.
Needed.
Oxford comma.
Confused.
Muse.
Wish it would shut up.
All right, there we go. That's all. I won't proclaim a winner because why bother?
We're all winners.
We're all winning. You all get participation awards.
Yeah.
We've all proven that we are writers and whizzes. Okay, we're gonna go ahead, and we're here because of Weech. Really,
it's my fault.
Yeah, it's your fault because you mentioned magic systems, and I went ooh, and I threw it out there, and you guys responded. So here we are.
And that was actually a panel I was looking to do with the fantasy genre over the weekend coming up.
That's
So
wonderful. Yeah,
we might be able to do a review of this and come back to it again.
Oh, yeah. And this is a topic that never dies. There's like a few of them. And Anita, the conversations we did earlier, I changed it over to the writer's life, which really is an open topic. So we can really explore a lot here. So honestly, the more open.
I think it suits more what we said too. So
Yeah. So I edit these as needed. And what I've been doing, let me see if I can find my phone, is I set a timer for every 25 minutes. So as it goes off, I pause, there's a break. That way I can edit it far more easier, and there's like a little, it's more digestible for the listeners. And Tim, I know your
Yes.
wife is there, Sandy, and
She
I
is in the
know
background, yes.
she I'm sorry. When
She's in the background.
when we get onto Doctor Who, I expect her to jump in.
Well, she actually will be leaving for work in a little under an hour, so
Oh, okay. All right.
I'll have to jump in on her behalf.
I'm sure you will. That's all right. And by the way, everyone here is a Whovian.
Yeah.
Nice.
I am so happy about that. I saw faces and I'm like, ah. Okay. All right. The timer is somewhat set because I'm still learning how to use my phone. Okay. Dun, dun, dun. There we go. Okay. I want to take a moment, and we are talking about fantasy magic systems, but really it's whatever kind of comes along. And go ahead, take a moment now and introduce yourself. We'll start with Weech, and then we'll go through the circle.
I am MLS Weech, or what? Oh, I'm going to wait. I'm going to shut up.
Yeah, it's all right. It's all right. I cut you off. Introduce yourself. Talk about your books a little bit. Tell us what you write and what your contribution to the fantasy world is. No
now
pressure.
I'm stuck because I'm like, I contributed? No, professional. I am MLS Weech. I am the author of 2 books that are currently out, The Journals of Bob Richter and Caught. Both of those are supernatural thrillers. And they each have deeper systems that as I write more products in those worlds, people will be able to better understand how mystical they are. But I'm currently working on my 3rd for the Slush Brain anthology, and I'm really excited about that because the editor got back to me and she's still talking to me, so that's always a good sign. And that's what I'm working on.
That's awesome. And Rosemary, go ahead. Introduce yourself. Tell me about your books and what you've contributed to the fantasy genre.
So I'm Rosemary A. Johns, and I write the Rebel Vampire series, and that's Blood Dragons and Blood Shackles. And the 3rd book is coming out on June 13th. That's Blood Renegades. And that's set in a divided paranormal London where vampires are both the predators and the prey. And it's a reinvention of vampires. And from a sort of magical systems point of view, the whole world is different. The whole concept of a camouflage predator that's evolved alongside us. And it's a sort of science fiction as well as a fantasy take on it. Mm-hmm. And I also write short stories as well.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of science fantasy, you said the magic words and Richard appeared. Hello, Richard. I don't know if you can hear us right away. Tim, go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll cut over to Richard.
Yeah, I'm Timothy Bateson. I'm a science fiction and urban fantasy writer. A little bit like Rosemary, I'm actually kind of trying to reinvent some of the vampire and werewolf mythologies over the years. I'm the writer of the Shadows over Seattle series alongside my wife, Sandy, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. And my contribution to fantasy, reinvention.
And Anita, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us about your books.
Okay, I'm Anita Stewart. I write under AF Stewart. I write dark fantasy and some horror. And I've got a couple of novellas out right now, epic stuff, epic fantasy, and one fairy tale, very screwed up fairy tale novella. And I'm currently working on finishing up my Ghosts of the Sea Moon, which is an epic fantasy, and Camelot Immortals will be the next one I work on, which is a King Arthur story in the modern world.
And Richard, thank you for joining us. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us your contribution to the fantasy world. And I think you are muted still. And I believe you're on a cell phone, so I'm not quite sure where the mute is on that.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Okay, here, let me hop in my car real quick. It's a little windy.
Yep, that's fine.
Okay. So I am Richard M. Mulder. I'm the author. Well, first off, I'm the, wow, brain's not working.
It's all right. Take a moment. It's all right.
Just catching my breath here. Okay. So I am the co-producer of Sci-Fan magazine. Now myself and Dane Edmondson, we got together and we put every month since January we've put together a magazine based upon science fantasy. Joe Compton, he's going to be featuring an episode about science fantasy next week on the 30th. So make sure you take a look at that, and that introduces a bit more about what science fantasy is and our contribution to it. So I'm also the author of the Sci-Fan Universe series. The first one is about to be re-released on June 1st. It's called Conquest, a lit RPG story, and pretty excited for that to come back out.
Right. And I'm Angela Chrysler. I have Zombies from Space and Vampires releasing on April 7th, and Tales of the Druid, which is my fantasy series. And I also have my memoir, Broken, out. And we're here to discuss magic systems. And I'm going to just put pressure on Weech all night long. So why did you want to talk about magic systems?
I'm a huge fan of fantasy as a whole. And I'm seeing a trend that's really interesting to me. It's really enjoyable, where magic is becoming a deeper concept and a more integral part of the plot rather than a complication that people have to face. And I enjoy talking about magic systems the same reason I enjoy talking when I was a kid, talking to my friends about comic books. Oh, no, Nightcrawler is way better than Wolverine because Nightcrawler can do this. And even into adulthood, at the school where I teach, one time we went off on a whole tangent because we got bored, so we were trying to mathematically identify how far Nightcrawler could travel in per look. So in the Navy, you learn about things like the Golden Mean, and you learn about how people travel and whatnot. So for me, the enjoyment of fantasy and the enjoyment of storytelling is in the ability of a reader to really fall into a world and just have fun with talking about who would win a fight, or how would this work, or what would make this possible, or what would happen if. And the magic systems that are out now allow for a whole lot more of that discussion because the readers understand the magic better, and they're not left with, well, I don't know, they're all wizards, they're all magical. And that's something that I've enjoyed, and I think it's a parallel that's been borrowed from the comic book industry.
That's really deep.
I think it's because they've become more rational. It's what you're saying. It's become they're rational as opposed to, as you're saying, that's just the way they are, or they're magical, and they've become. And that's, I think, what we're talking about, a magical system where there's a rationality to it, and there are laws, and there's a danger that occurs to you if those laws aren't kept. And so as writers, we have to sit down and truly map that out and think about that properly. And before you start to write, you have to really make a decision on those worlds.
Yeah, no, and there's a process when you do write, and when you do get into it, you how many times have you sat down and then gone back and rewritten the magic system because there was an inconsistency, or you realized that there was a conflict, or maybe you made the person too powerful, so you had to go back and change it, and that and in itself altered the entire book, and you had to rewrite the entire book as a result.
Yeah, you have to put the limitation. I mean, you're saying about power, one of the sort of three really key things is one of the, there are three key things, I think, but one of those three key things is the limitation.
Yeah.
It's the limitation you have to put on the power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the consequences to those limitations.
And the consequence of that limitation.
You gotta have a scale, a limitation, and a consequence.
You've really broken down this formula.
Well, see, I have to attribute the source of my information. I highly identify and subscribe to the theory put forth by author Brandon Sanderson. He's done several panels, and all I do is, because I'm a nerd at heart, I listen to him and I'm like, yes. And then when I get into other conversations to sound intelligent, I just repeat things of that. But so that I don't have to pay him every time I open my mouth, I end up I always have my students are counting how many witticisms I have, how many quotes and little catchphrases. I'm up to 34 on training day 2.
Oh, that's
because they're counting because they're like, he never shuts up, and I'm like, well, no, but so I always try to find little cheat codes, little algorithms that I can say in a sentence. You know, you have to have these things, or this is the way things have to work, because that allows me to break it down. And then when I'm writing, I'm a discovery writer at heart. And when you're a discovery writer and you're working with a magic system, it's asking for trouble.
Yeah.
Because while you're writing, you're like, I'm going to have him do this. Why? Because it's cool. And then you're looking at it and be like, yeah, but he can't do that. I would argue though that when you run into those, sometimes the problem is an opportunity. So when you're writing and you're working within a magic system and you need your character to be able to do something, or your character does something he should not be able to do, you're allowed the opportunity to decide, do I want to make this a plot point, or do I want to take the opportunity to evolve this magic system and find out how it works? But I just didn't want anyone to think that, like, no, I'm really, really smart. No, I'm just really good at looking at what masters do and stealing it from them.
Very good. It's good to know where you stand.
Yeah. I'm on the evolution side. So go ahead, Richard.
Interesting that you mentioned evolving magic systems. That's actually a big part of science fantasy that we've been implementing. A big part of that is so science fantasy. There's 3 levels. There's soft science fantasy. That's what we've come to know, such as Avatar and whatnot too. And both science fiction and fantasy are present in the same realm, but they don't necessarily complement each other. Or there's standard science fantasy, such as Star Wars, where yes, it does complement each other. Or there's the newest level, which is what you're talking about involving here. We call it enlightened science fantasy. It's where magic is enhanced by the use of technology, or vice versa. Mm-hmm. So technology is enhanced because of magic. And so I find that very interesting you bring that up.
Yeah, that's what interested me most. The best example I can talk about without just making this a panel on why Sanderson is awesome is the TV show Airbender, or The Last Airbender. Mm-hmm. So we had the Ong series, and we got to know this whole world. And then they did the next evolution called The Legend of Korra. You can argue about how awesome one is over the other, but what interested me about it is it showed what happened generations after, and it based the evolution off of what these people could do and what their capabilities are. So it opened the world to the possibility of what would happen if this magic continued on. What would happen? How would the world react? What would you do if you could fire lightning bolts out of your finger? What would a power company look like when you do that? What would a water company look like if you can control water? And when I saw that, I took other ideas that I had, and I took that, and I realized what that potential is. There's a place for everything that you do, but what interested me most was accepting the challenge and enjoying the process of showing the evolution of a society, so that you can always follow it. You can take advantage of every time period. It's something that one of my later projects that I'm working on in 2019 is all based on that concept, and that's going to be a thing that finally bridges the gap. I remember early on, if you were a science fiction fan, you were not a fantasy fan.
Yeah, I remember those days. Yeah, there was a very, very clear line.
That divide used to be there, but I used to work in a local library, and I actually found that by filing science fiction and fantasy in the same section, a lot of people started crossing over. I think it's down to. I think a lot of that's down to authors like Piers Anthony's doing his Incarnations of Immortality series, where he has both fiction, science, and fantasy side by side in the world. And then you've got coming up now. You've got a lot of new authors who are bridging those gaps between the two. with similar kinds of storylines, where that background of science is there, the world develops, and you start seeing the magic side of it. And I think Piers Anthony is actually a great example of that one with the Incarnation series.
And the Phase series.
Yeah, and my wife's just reminded me of the Phase series and a few other things going on. But the nice thing I liked about looking through the Incarnation series is you start with a very simple story, but you start seeing that evolution progressively over a short period of time, coming from a background of reality into a much deeper fantasy set. And alongside all that, you've still got that science going on. So it was a very well thought out system, and I really like it. But I think for me, I always focus more on the short term evolution on the magic side than Reach does. I was looking at C.L. Schneider's books, The Crown of Stones, and while you've got that long-term evolution in there, you also have that short-term focus, and she does it in such a way that you really see the development of not just the character, but his whole magic power system, and it follows a logical progression as he learns.
I have to clarify here, because it's a really stunning story.
Yes.
Her character is addicted to magic, and magic is actually viewed as a drug in this world. It's only handled by a certain group called the Shinri, and they have been outlawed and slaughtered because of their magic use.
Enslaved.
And this particular character, her main character, was bred from a purebred Shinri, and a purebred Shinri under slavehood to get a purebred Shinri magic wielder. And they all try to hold him. They all take turns trying to control him, and it really gets out of hand. But one of the things that I loved about her magic system was when you go to use it, it's no different than a heroin addict shooting up. So, which was really a unique look on the magic system.
I love the consequences were enormous in the system. I mean, you had the magic blindness, which basically left you weakened and effectively stunned by the use of the magic, especially the more powerful it became. But then you also had the fact that it took life force to run the magic, and it didn't care necessarily where that life came from. But as Ian's character develops, and as the story plot moves on, you start finding out that there are ways to circumvent certain restrictions, that you have to have been bred from certain bloodlines to do it. And I really loved that aspect of it. She not only thought about how the magic's going to develop, but also thought about the rules of where it came from, how it became the way it is now, and showed over flashbacks and journeys back through time, through the visions, exactly how the situation arrived at where they are at the start of the story, and how actions later on have actually enforced and developed to the point where the story, it couldn't have happened any other way.
I wish Cindy were here to talk about her. Because for me, what I'm starting to do is I'm starting to think of my magic systems as characters in and of themselves. And so when you're writing it, because you have to be cognizant of the danger. The better your reader understands your magic system, the more you can do with it. And if you throw them a curveball, they will only be forgiving if you either go back and explain how it was possible or reveal that it's a plot point. And so when you're working on it, if you take the time to talk about it, then you can think about how does it evolve, what are some of the backgrounds, because like anything in the world, when you have something, people are going to try to find out how to use it. In the Navy, we're the best ever at making use of things in ways that they shouldn't be used to get what we need to get done. with all appropriateness, but at the end of the day, most sailors can do more with duct tape in 10 minutes than anyone should ever be able to do, because we're so used to having to operate and think quickly. So when you're developing a magic system, it's that same concept. When I put my characters in this position and they have these options, what would they be left with, and what could they discover when they're in those situations?
Mm-hmm. It's a balance, because it has to feel so integral that it's entirely natural. So that, because often you come across in books where you're constantly having explanation and you're constantly waiting while they tell you this, that, and the other about the, well, let me just stop, says the writer, while I tell you about this wonderful book, because I took ages to work this out for you. And it's like, I just want it to happen. And so, but at the same time, you don't want, and I can't remember the book, but I was reading, and it was a world in which they had magic, in which there wasn't enough limitations, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And there was a really easy way in which they could have just magically flown up the building, whatever it was. Mm-hmm. And they didn't. They went up in an elevator, or whatever. And it was like, what? And it's that kind of moment. And the second you do that, you have that kind of moment where you're thinking, well, why didn't they just fly up the building? Then it's a moment ago they were, doing amazing spells and curses and saving themselves out. And now they're going up in an elevator. Why would this world even have elevators? If I could fly around everywhere, I'd be flying. Elevators wouldn't have been invented, Yeah,
the consequences.
So, the consequences, and it's making it seem so easy that if there was a society, or where, I don't know, you're living on blood or whatever, you're a vampire, right? If that society, but it is so woven into what you're writing that you're not constantly having to stop. And if you are constantly stopping, you're making it amusing, or you're making it entertaining, or you're making it thrilling, but you're doing something with it. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a real balancing act when you're writing, is getting it in there, but thrilling or amusing, or just simply making it really natural.
What's your opinion? I want to ask you, what's your opinion on, because you're not going to develop a complex magic system without the requirement of some exposition. At what point do you feel exposition becomes a crutch for the writer to be like, well, look, I got no other place to put this, and you need to know how this works?
My opinion is really quickly. I think exposition is a real danger. That fantasy has a problem with exposition. I love fantasy. I think everyone can tell I love fantasy, but I think one of the big downsides comparative to other genres is exposition. And I think that a lot of fantasy authors,
one of the things that I found a way around that problem, because there's a lot of backstory, and I kind of took I stole from Tolkien here with Silmarillion. I use my blog. And what I'll do is I'll stop and I'll take the story out and I'll explain it. And in fact, I have a whole section on my blog where I go into the magic stories, and you've been on my blog. But here's what I love to do. At the end of every one of my books, there is a disclaimer that states, thank you for reading the book. You've unlocked X. Go to my website. You can get the sneak previews. Enter the password X, and there you go. So whenever anyone reads one of my books, they have access to a private section of my blog that gives them behind the scenes or the making of the book. And that is where I put my exposition.
Benedict Jacker, who's a British author, he does that as well. And he's fantastic. He's like a British Jim Butcher. That's how he's. Okay, I'm not saying he is, but he is quite. He does the Alex Verus novels. He's like a paranormal mage in London, and he does something similar, which is like he takes it deeper than he does in his books. Yeah. And I think the way around exposition is to show it through action and it actually happening. And as I said, make it amusing, make it interesting, make it through characters having to have emotional moments between them happening, and it's shown through that. And yes, you're going to have some exposition, but I would just keep it as light on exposition. That's one of my things, my pet peeves.
I have to get into this because this is just like as we're talking about consequences and evolution of magic systems, it's just, I have a point here, and it's just amazing with what I saw.